I'm so excited to be here with you tonight to talk a little bit about a series of ideas that have concerned me and many of our colleagues in the strategy area for many years now, and that has to do with this challenge of how large established organizations can innovate to overcome the challenges of creative destruction that Sarah briefly introduced. So, what we're thinking about here is how great companies, great organizations, great institutions in government and in other sectors can adapt to the kinds of changes that have led to some catastrophic failures of corporations in the past. Now, in order to start thinking about that idea, we've grasped onto this concept of moonshots, and I'm sure that you've run into this idea of moonshots in your own thinking, in your own work, and so on. It's a phrase that's often used to describe major breakthroughs, like the microprocessor, like the original personal computer, sometimes identified as the Apple II. We could have a conversation about where the first personal computer actually came from. But, it's often associated with the Apple II, with the web, with the iPhone, with autonomous vehicles. Very famously, Google has invested $800 million to try to come up with these moonshot ideas, which are supposed to be these large breakthroughs. And the original conceptualization of a moonshot kind of ties back to this speech by John Kennedy in 1962 at Rice University, in which he explained and motivated a massive investment by the United States in a space program that was designed to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade, or as he said from my adopted hometown of Boston, decade. At the time. The goal was to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade, using his phrase, man on the moon. So this idea of a moonshot really resonates with this concept of an aspiration, an inspiring goal that can be used to organize effort on about a 5 to 10 year horizon. Now, this moonshot idea has arisen in what, for many large organizations, is an age of disruption. I see some of my students in the room. We've recently talked about Blockbuster and Kodak and General Motors going bankrupt. The model of disruption, which I have on the page here, on the screen here, it harkens back to some ideas that originated with Clay Christensen's Innovator's Dilemma in 1997. They themselves, those ideas also have a history to them. The idea is that industries go through life cycles, each of which is represented by one of these S-curves. So over time, what happens is there's a long period of kind of entrepreneurship where there isn't a lot of value created, but then a breakthrough occurs, there's a big increase, and then ultimately industries go into maturity. That inspires what Clay called disruption, this idea of trying to break through that limit on value creation associated with disruption. Now, this model, there's various critiques of it and so on, but I've relied on it in the article to raise a couple of ideas that are useful to this conversation about how to integrate this moonshot concept with questions about disruption for large organizations. The industry life cycle is a valuable idea. The idea that industries create value for their customers and their suppliers is valuable. The idea that there are limits on what a set of ideas can generate, and the aspirational idea of trying to break through that limit and initially performing worse, but ultimately motivating, the change, even though initial performance on the new S-curve is poorer than on the old S-curve, we go through it, we put ourselves through it because the goal is to achieve that breakthrough that will lead us to a higher level in the future here. There's much more to say about this here, but let me keep going and trying to give you an intuition for some of the ideas that we've been working on. So what motivates going through the pain of disruption is achieving that ultimate moonshot at the end of the second S-curve. Now, established organizations, it's too bad that Kodak and Blockbuster went out of business, but in the end, they are entertainment companies. They're companies that nobody died. Nobody died when, it's terrible to say, but, in the end, they make cameras and film and videos, and it's terrible that we've lost them, but something came through and replaced them that is valuable to us, valuable to us now. We're now in a situation where, you know, industries that are under disruption, we can't have these industries fail. It can't happen that the hospitals in downtown Toronto close their doors because they're disrupted by new technology. FinTech can't take down the ATMs even for an app. We have to figure out how to help established organizations in these core infrastructure industries make a transition from success on an old business model through this painful transition to achieve the kinds of breakthroughs that are described often as moonshots. So what we've been working on, and certainly in my office, with my graduate students and with many of our colleagues have also been working on these ideas, is trying to think about, okay, what can we learn from successful institutions that have been able to disrupt themselves and break through the limits on value creation in their old business models and achieve the kinds of transformation that are necessary to support, you know, help, innovation at the level that Sarah was describing. There are examples. So, you know, again, my students, several of them here, have heard me talk about this. You know, Avis acquired Zipcar a few years ago and didn't wreck it. Instead of trying to jam, as they've heard me say, orange Pontiac Aztecs into all the Zipcar spots, you know, what Avis did was really, you know, invest at a level that was sustaining in the airport model of car rentals, but then really think about how to innovate and how to actualize Avis's mission, which is now a mobility services, has been framed as the Moonshot as a mobility services company. How can we solve mobility problems? That means they're using Zipcars now to support Uber drivers. If you want to drive for Uber but you don't have a car, they have a program now at Avis that you can have a Zipcar. You can drive a Zipcar as an Uber driver. They have a program now where you can take a Zipcar across the city of London and park it in a different parking space. So they're coming up with these different ideas that really fulfill a moonshot at Avis of thinking of themselves as really a sharing economy company supported by this cool brand and now porting in all of the capabilities that they had as a longtime rental car company. So that's a successful integration of old capabilities that developed on an old business model with new capabilities that are necessary to achieve a sharing economy identity. I have some others here. I'll mention briefly Kaiser Permanente, an incredible healthcare organization that moved from a conceptualization of its mission as providing medical care to providing health. Now, that sounds like a simple transition, but if what you're trying to do is keep people healthy, that's your moonshot, that's your goal, you invest in prevention at a different level than you do if what you think of yourself as doing is running some clinics. And there's some inspiring stories there. So what my article does, and you know, I have to say, this is truly a collaboration with my friend Karen Christensen, who is an amazing colleague that is part of why our community has been become what it is. And so thank you, Karen. You'll see in the article that you have in your hand that I've suggested 5 questions that are useful for trying to figure out what your moonshot would be. First one is to try to understand what's that limit on value creation that represents that drives the maturity of your model. I'll never forget going to visit some senior leaders at General Motors, and they showed me the most amazing technology, the most amazing new cars that they had. And yet they couldn't introduce them without having a negotiation with the union about how they would be manufactured and having a conversation with the franchise dealerships about how ownership would take place and how they would be leased. The business model was anchored in ideas from the 1920s. And see, the barriers to technology innovation for these established companies, we see this over and over again, they're not technological. They're organizational and cultural. So the first question is, what are those limits on creativity that come from those old ideas? The second has to do with what new ideas will enable breakthrough value. At Avis, it was taking very seriously this sharing economy concept and their identity as an organization founded back on a 1921 era idea that cars could be shared, and taking that and reinterpreting it in light of 2013, 2015 ideas about what technology enables in terms of sharing of these vehicles. The third question is, if you could do it from scratch now, what would be the best way to fulfill your organization's mission over the next 5 to 10 years? And again, I admire the leadership of Avis for not wrecking Zipcar and for extending the Zipcar model along those lines. The fourth is, can you identify an aspirational, inspiring, and inspired goal along the lines of we're going to put somebody on the moon and bring them back again? You know, this is something a 5-year-old can understand. We're going to cultivate human health. We're going to try to, we're going to try to improve the impact of cars on the environment by creating more sharing. And these are important aspirational goals that have social value that goes well beyond the earnings statements and the short-term aspirations for the economic return on investment of these companies. For Kaiser Permanente, it's health, not medical care. Merck, same thing. We're in the business of creating human health, not medicines. A profound change. And then the final question is there enough value in the goal to engage all the stakeholders that you need and provide a return on investment for the risks they have to take to help you get there? The final point that I'd like to make before I conclude is that there's also a few notes in the article about implementation. How do you align interests of stakeholders? How do you manage this as an ecosystem and platform play? How do you make smart decisions about contracts and investments? Many examples here, examples from JP Morgan Chase, from Apple, to sort of highlight what it takes to be successful in doing that. Thank you so much for your attention, and with that, I'll turn it over to David.